Around a couple of years ago, Dr. Lisa Unangst and Dr. Nick Gozik started a conversation around a term that is increasingly and widely used: diversity. It was realized that while diversity has become such a cornerstone that an increasingly large amount of resources in all types of organizations are allocated towards diversity training and workshops, diversity programs and initiatives are progressively put in place. There are journals that focus exclusively on the topic of diversity in higher education. Diversity units, departments, and offices commonly form at higher education institutions and beyond. And yet, the term seems to lack a common definition that is agreed upon cross-nationally. In an attempt to investigate whether and how the term diversity can differ in meaning cross-nationally and cross-culturally, Courtney, Hartzell, and myself joined to form a research team and work on a journal article to kickstart an academic conversation around this topic. The goal here is not to say that no efforts should be allocated toward ensuring and supporting diversity in all settings, but rather employing a critical inquiry with a cross-national lens to become more informed in supporting effective initiatives. This video is inspired by our work on a journal article that analyzed 135 abstracts concerning diversity and higher education in 3 countries: France, Germany, and the United States. The hypothesis here is that there is a difference in the way in which people understand the term diversity cross-nationally, and sometimes within the country's boundaries itself. To understand how it differs, let's look at the concept through 2 lenses. The first is operational, as it relates to practitioners in the field. For example, Dr. Gozik's former work as a director for an Office of International Programs required him to collaborate with international partners.
When you sit down and you start using words like diversity, we find that at the end of the day, we're not actually talking about the same thing. So until we really know what we're talking about, it makes it hard for us to move forward in a thoughtful and intentional way. And I would argue, and I'm happy to expand on it, it would make it very difficult for us to really lead to actual change. Until we know what we're doing and why we're doing it, it becomes almost impossible to get to the next stages of moving beyond the status quo.
And this is something that's particularly interesting when we look at transnational alliances, for example, when you have universities in different countries working together and maybe trying to come up with statements on diversity and inclusion.
The second lens relates to research and scholarship.
So how do we think about an emerging body of scholarship, an emerging field of practice around diversity, equity, equality, justice, when indeed the definitions themselves are quite difficult, right? How do we know what to operationalize and how to research that operationalization when the terms themselves are rather fuzzy?
Dr. Rohini Anand was previously the Global Chief Diversity Officer for Sodexo. In a meeting with international partners about a global diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative, she recalls one meeting in which a French colleague told her, "Diversity is a very American thing. It does not apply to us in Europe, as we already have so many nationalities here." That is when Rohini realized the thesis of this video.
I did another quick, just very short questionnaire to colleagues in Spain a couple of years ago. My Spanish colleagues said when they thought about diversity, they were thinking about students with disabilities primarily. When we had a colleague not too long after that come from Japan, from a partner institution, he gave a whole presentation on diversity. And he looked at students with disabilities, and he also looked at LGBTQ plus students. So that's how he defined it. If we think about diversity in the US, it would be almost impossible to talk about it without talking about race and racism.
In the German context, diversity offices are the closest analog to that, really have been focused on women, right? So gender diversity. And, in the case of the US, again, to come back to just a single national example, I worked on a paper that looked at chief diversity officers and what diversity statements or diversity visions at institutions employing chief diversity officers identified. which categories they identified when they talked about diversity. And that study found that some institutions identified things like folks who had served in the military, right? So whether they had veteran status, whether they had caring responsibilities, whether that was for parents or other members of the family. In some cases, they talked about substance use.
There is a difference on a neurological level that seems to be connected to culture in the way in which we think about and understand terms and concepts.
What do we visualize? Who do we visualize when we're thinking about these terms?
And those differences in what or who we visualize when we think about a term such as diversity also relate to how we react to it. In the study that the four of us in this video spent over a year on, we concluded a difference in reaction between the US on the one hand and France and Germany on the other. In the US context, legislative and systemic change was found to be a common recommendation to address lack of diversity. Whereas in both France and Germany, a classroom-based pedagogical approach was a more common recommendation to address the issue. And in a different study,
in looking at, for example, some Irish university equity plans this past year, my co-author and I noticed that I think really one of the plans that we looked at mentioned anything like an advocacy role for those institutions in affecting legislation or policy in those national contexts, including policy that could directly relate to the iteration of diversity offices at those same higher education institutions, right? So to what extent we understand higher education institutions as reflexive across different public and private systems, I think is also an important element to keep in mind. And as Nick said before, right, we're referencing here, I think, different types of government, different types of democracies, and again, those all mean very different things.
Across nations, a general concept can be agreed on, but where it gets complicated is when you look at the application of things relating to diversity. So this is especially sensitive to national histories and current contexts.
We look at what the root cause of inequality and inequities, include, and that's often the systems themselves and the processes themselves and the policies themselves. And so that has led in the US, at a minimum, to, when we talk about diversity, to be considering looking at whole systemic change, thinking about how we really analyze what's going on, the subtext, and how we need to ultimately shift things in a much more significant way.
So there are cultural and historic reasons for these differences in both our understanding of the term diversity and our reactions to it. The goal of this video is to highlight exactly that, because in a highly globalized world, it is becoming more and more important to have a global perspective on all topics to become better global and cross-cultural communicators.